to topical policy issues in Indonesia. FKP aims to bring together researchers, academics, experts, civil society, international community, as well as policymakers to discuss various issues around Indonesia policies. It is hoped that this forum will generate ideas to help improve Indonesia's public policies. Before we begin today's presentations, please let me inform that there are pojok publikasi where you can take some of the SMERU's publications for free, and there are also free flow drinks, coffee and tea, and toilet in the side of this room. And in the case of emergency, you can use the emergency exit on my right side. Although this room is equipped by CCTVs, I need to remind you that this event is open for public, so please take care of your own belongings. This event is accessible through online streaming at www.smeru.or.id/streaming. And for those watching online, you can drop your questions to SMERU's Twitter account at SMERU Institute or Facebook account, the SMERU Research Institute. For the next 2 hours, we allocate 40 minutes of presentations and the remaining time for question and answer sessions. But I think Allison asked that if you want to have a questions during her presentation, is fine. And today we are pleased to welcome Allison Derrick. Welcome, Allison. She is a Ph.D. candidate at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and her dissertation title is Essays in Commodity Booms, Local Economies, and Human Capital Investment. Her fields of interest is applied microeconomics and development. She is one of the three doctoral students who received the Bricks and Mortar Boards Fellowship. This fellowship has enabled Allison to undertake specialized trainings in international trade and economic development, and to have more understanding on the new international agricultural economy. Allison was a visiting scholar at the Universitas Padjadjaran Bandung in December 2016 to January 2017. And this October, she is also a visiting scholar at the CSIS Jakarta. Today, she will share her job market paper about agricultural export boom and household income. So, Allison, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming. I'm really excited to be here and present my paper. I'm happy to take any questions during the presentation or after. It's really up to you. But I'm presenting my job market paper titled Money That Grows on Trees, Household Consumption During an Agricultural Export Boom. So the main question I'm trying to answer in my paper is how agricultural export booms affect households, particularly in developing countries. And so from what we know about export booms, not just for agricultural products, but really any commodity, is that a boom should raise household consumption, and likewise a bust should decrease household consumption. And so by a boom, I mean the price of a commodity increases really rapidly, and during a bust, the price of that commodity falls. So the setting where I try to answer this question is the palm oil boom in Indonesia, and I look specifically at the period 2000 to 2015. So I try and answer whether or not household expenditure follows this pattern, whether we see this increase during the boom and decrease during the bust. And so I see household expenditure as a measure for consumption, or you could alternatively see it as a proxy for income. So also in my paper, I do a deeper analysis of producing districts. So I try and look at different producer characteristics. So the global commodity price boom and bust the boom started around 2005, and it involved not just the price of palm oil, but the price of pretty much all commodities globally traded. It peaked in 2008 and has been declining ever since 2011 for most commodities, including palm oil. So we know that the global price of a commodity is going to determine the aggregate revenue that a country or economy receives from producing this commodity. But it's less clear how much of this revenue actually reaches households. So I'm going to exploit this commodity price boom and bust during the last decade to try and identify changes in household expenditure due to these price changes. So the two producer characteristics I look at are plantation size, so looking at smallholder plantations or districts with mostly smallholder plantations, then districts with mostly large plantations, so these are private estates or corporate plantations. And I also compare new and established plantations. So I look at districts that have an established palm oil industry prior to 2001, and then districts that I classify as new or relatively new to the scene as starting to produce after 2001. So here is a graph that compares the price indices for several major commodity groups and palm oil from 1995 to 2015. So you can see, well, palm oil is the blue line, metals is the yellow line, all commodities is the red line, and fuels, so it would be like oil, gas, coal, is the green line. And you can see that they all follow a fairly similar trend. So from, kind of 1995 to 2005, or maybe 2003, they're not changing that much. Okay. But after 2005 and following through 2008, there's like this really large increase. And so actually from 2000 to 2008, the price of palm oil triples. And so there's a kind of what I would classify as a false recovery in 2011 with the stimulus packages from the US and China. So the prices of a lot of commodities started to recover, but since then, prices have been on the decline. So I classify really the pre-2008 period as the boom and the post-2008 period as the bust. So during this time, Indonesia is starting to produce a lot more palm oil on a lot more land. So here I show the amount of harvested land area in Indonesia from 1995 to 2015 compared to other major estate crops. So I have sugarcane, cocoa, rubber, and coffee. And you can see that really the amount of land that is dedicated to palm oil vastly overwhelms all of the other estate crops. And it's really like increasing drastically over this period. Likewise for estate crops production, the graphs look very similar. So compared to the other common estate crops in Indonesia, the production in terms of tons for palm oil is rising rapidly over the period and is much more than the other commodities. So for my empirical results, my main method is just to perform kind of a difference in difference estimation. So I look at producer districts compared to non-producer districts. And I find that in producing districts, average household expenditure in the district is going to rise during the boom and falls during the bust, as we would expect. But actually, expenditure is much more sensitive to a price decrease than a price increase. And when I further look at producer characteristics, so I look at districts with mostly smallholder production, average household expenditure is going to increase during the boom and falls during the bust. And the reason, and they fall by about the same magnitude. But for large plantations, expenditures don't significantly change in either period. So I think the reason that is because they're more insulated from these price shocks. So for smallholders, the revenue depends directly on the price of palm oil, whereas with districts with mostly large plantations like corporate or large estates, most of the effect of the palm oil boom is going to come from an increase in employment. Okay, so for new and established producer districts, the expenditure also rises and falls, follows this similar pattern, but the increase for established plantations is much larger. So I further look at expenditures by looking specifically at spending on education and health. So education spending actually doesn't change that much during the boom and falls during the bust. And actually health spending will increase during the boom and falls during the bust but by a much larger percentage than total expenditure. Okay, so this study fits into a really large literature on commodity booms and busts and really looking at the local effects like local households, income, expenditure, employment, these sorts of outcomes. And many of them have focused on energy booms in the US and Canada. So for example, looking at like the shale oil boom in the US, and a few other papers have looked at developing countries. So one example would be the local impacts of a Peruvian gold mine. But all of these papers find this similar pattern that I've been in kind of explaining to you, that booms increase employment, income, and expenditure, but following a bust, these trends are largely reversed. So what I see as lacking in the literature is an analysis of an agricultural export boom. So there's a lot of reasons why an agricultural export boom might be different from a natural resource boom, something that's really extractive, so something like mining or the development of oil and gas. So for one, agriculture is much more labor intensive, so it has the potential to directly employ a lot more people. And also the rents from extractive resources are much more easily captured by a few, right? So agriculture can be done on a really small scale, for example, in this context by smallholders. But an agriculture boom is similar to a fossil fuel boom, for example, in some other ways. For one, it could be a type of resource curse because it exposes the economy to the volatility of the global commodity price. So there was a previous study that looked at a similar question, and so it looked at palm oil plantation expansion, which reduced poverty in Indonesia from 2000 to 2008 by Ryan Edwards. But I think a big flaw is that it examines this period during which the palm oil price triples, and it doesn't really answer what happened after the bust. So in this study, I'm going to expand the time period to 2015 to capture this decrease in the palm oil price. So I think this paper is going to contribute to the policy debate between the economy and the environment when it comes to palm oil. So it's traditionally been about the economic benefits versus the environmental costs, right? And so we know that these environmental costs can be quite large due to deforestation, carbon emissions, and air quality. But I think my results show that the economic benefits could be quite smaller than previously thought. So to guide my empirical estimation, I modify the classic booming sector model. So traditionally it's been used for energy export booms, to model the general equilibrium impacts of, for example, a resource discovery or a really large price increase. But I modify it to look at just an agricultural export boom. And so the key is that there are really different assumptions about factor intensity used in the industry. So instead of having the booming industry be really capital intensive, I model it as very labor intensive. And so it's a general equilibrium model with 3 goods and 3 factors. And I use it to generate some static short-run predictions about what would happen during a price boom and bust. So this is the setup of the model. I have 3 goods, one of which is the agricultural export, one is another export or traded good, and then one is a non-traded good. So 3 factors are labor, capital, and land is going to be specific to the booming sector, so specific to agricultural production. I assume factors are fixed in the short run. Another really general assumption is that it's a small open economy, so each district is going to be a price taker. And the supply of palm oil is fixed in the short run. So the reason I assume this is because you plant the seedlings and then it takes 3 years for them to reach maturity and to be able to harvest any palm fruit. So in the long run, of course, if you can relax these assumptions because these factors won't be fixed. So I generate several predictions from this model. The first one is the key prediction, is that an increase with a large price increase, there should be an increase in the return to palm oil producing land, and also the palm oil industry should expand. An increase in the nominal wage, but an ambiguous effect on the real wage. This is because it depends on the magnitude of the price changes and also household decisions about which goods to consume. A decrease in the nominal and real return to capital. A contraction of the other traded sector. And an expansion of the non-traded sector. So that would be goods and services. So I draw, yes? So the reason that is because the booming sector is labor intensive. Yeah, so most of the returns are from a price increase are going to go to the palm oil producing land, so land that's really suitable for palm oil production. Yeah, in the classic model, when the booming sector is capital intensive, the return to capital would increase. So I draw on several different data sources. The first one is SUSENAs, where I gather household expenditure and other household characteristics like employment information. And so I also collect agroclimatic suitability for palm oil cultivation data from the FAO. And I use this to instrument for a palm oil producing district later in my analysis. I find palm oil production data and some district characteristics from Indodapur. My commodity prices come from international financial statistics provided by the IMF. And so I take all of this data, I match it at the district level, and I aggregate it up to create a pseudo panel from 2000 to 2015. So this figure depicts how I classify districts. First, I look at producer and non-producer districts. So this classification isn't going to change the entire time. If you're a producer, you're always going to be a producer. So if you produce palm oil at any time, any amount from 2000 to 2015, I put you in the producer category. And so from the producer category, I have two different classifications. First, I classify by plantation age. So first, you could be an established or new producer. So you're an established producer if you produce anything before 2001. You're new if you start producing afterwards. And then I have smallholder and then what I'll call like corporate districts. So in smallholder districts, the average production over the time period is great. Smallholder production over the time period is greater than 50%. And so if you're a corporate, then your average production over the time period is mostly corporate. So since I'm employing kind of a difference in difference strategy, I wanted to check first whether or not expenditures are following a parallel trend between these two types of districts. So the black circles are going to be producer districts. The gray boxes are going to be non-producers. So you can see prior to this large price increase, they are do appear to be following a similar trend. I also look at education spending between the two types of districts. And you can see before the price increase, they do seem to be following, for the price increase, they seem to be following a similar trend. And there's a lot of movement, like after 2005. Similarly, health spending seems to follow a similar pattern. So in my first estimation, I look at how being a producer affects your household expenditure in each year. So I interact my producer indicator with a year dummy, and I also control for year fixed effects and district fixed effects. And then I cluster my standard errors at the district level. So my outcome variable is going to be the log of the district average household expenditure. So you can see actually, if you remember back to the price graph for palm oil, that it does appear in producer districts that household expenditure is really following these changes in the palm oil price. So we have that prior to 2005, household expenditure is lower in producer districts following the massive price increase from 2008, another peak in 2011, and afterwards it declines. So I also look at the producer type, so those different producer characteristics, and I perform a similar estimation where I interact that producer dummy with the year dummy. And so in the red is smallholder districts. So we can see that it appears smallholders are following that similar trend from before. They're following the palm oil price. Whereas in mostly corporate districts, it looks like there's not really that much movement compared to smallholders. And so so these bands are confidence intervals, and it doesn't really look like for corporate districts that any of the changes are significantly different from zero. So I perform a similar estimation for new and established producers, and I look, and so it does look like maybe there's more movement for established producers during the boom, but overall they look like they follow a similar pattern. So in the next step, seeing that household expenditure is following this palm oil price, I'm going to collapse the data into a boom and bust period. And these estimates are more robust because it kind of takes out a lot of these time trends and controls for more like district specific variation. So I have my dependent variable now is going to be the 8-year change in district average household expenditure. And then I still have the producer indicator, the same variable, and I interacted instead with a period dummy in period 1 and period 2. And then I still control for period trends, and I cluster the standard errors at the district level still. So with this estimation, we can see how being a producer determines how district average household expenditure is going to change in each period. Okay, so here in the first column is the main estimation. So during the first period, for producers, the effect appears to be about like 6%. So being a producer means that your household, being in a producer district, means your household expenditure should increase by about 6% on average. But during the bust, being a producer district, when you convert it into percentages, is also about 6%. So household expenditure should fall during the bust. So period 1 is the boom and period 2 is the bust. So I have several different specifications. So in the first column, I don't control for baseline characteristics. So these are like the employment characteristics for a district, the percent of the population that is urban in 2000. And then I also include period fixed effects the whole time. So in column 2, I include these baseline controls, and it doesn't appear to change the coefficients that much. They're not really significantly different. But the reason I have the third column is that including the baseline controls eliminates some districts that don't have observations in 2000. So it reduces the sample size. And in column 3, I re-estimate the same equation, but on the reduced sample size, just as comparison, but without the baseline controls. You can see that they're fairly consistent across these estimations. And here I've plotted the coefficients so it's more easily readable. So the gray estimates are the main estimations. The, I guess, light gray is with the baseline controls, and the blue is with that reduced sample size, but without baseline controls. So we see during the boom, there's a positive impact. During the bust, there's a negative impact. So I perform, again, a similar estimation by plantation size and plantation age. Instead, I interact the period dummy with that type variable. Okay. And so here it doesn't really look like, so these estimates are not significantly different from 0. So it doesn't really look like being in a corporate district during the boom or the bust has a significant effect on household expenditure. But for smallholder districts, in the first period, which is the boom period, being a smallholder again has about like a 6% increase in your household expenditure. But being in a smallholder district during the bust means your household expenditure will decline by about like 7.5%. So again, I include baseline controls as a robustness check and perform again the same estimation on the reduced sample size, and it doesn't really appear that the estimates change that drastically. And so again, here's a coefficient plot for the table so that it's more easy to read. And so you can see that the reason those estimates for corporate districts aren't significant is that the confidence intervals overlap with 0. But for smallholders in the boom and bust, they are significantly different from 0. So this is for new and established plantations. And we can see for most specifications for new districts, it doesn't really appear that there's a significant change in household expenditure during the boom or the bust, just in this one specification. But it's hard to really draw anything from that. In the established districts, we see that household expenditure is going to increase by about 8% during the boom and falls by less than that during the bust. So this is going to be a decrease of about like 7%. And so again, I have the 3 different specifications that are the same, including baseline controls and then estimating on the reduced sample size. And the estimates don't really vary that much across specifications. And again, here's a coefficient plot showing the same estimates, where mostly established plantations are seeing the benefits of the boom, but are also exposed to this price decrease during the bust. So there might be some concerns about the endogeneity of the producer indicator. The reason this could be is that maybe the development of a palm oil industry could, in a given district, is correlated with household expenditure. So, for example, one scenario could be that palm oil corporations could choose to locate in a district where households are poor and unskilled labor is relatively cheap. Or it could be that districts with many poor landowning households are going to self-select into the palm oil industry because they expect their expenditures and consumption to rise if they produce palm oil. So I used the percentage of district land that is highly suitable for oil palm as an instrument for the producer indicator. So this is what that variable looks like. So this is a map that shows land suitability for palm oil cultivation across Indonesia. This green color is going to be land that is highly suitable for oil palm. The medium areas are going to be this kind of yellow color, and the low areas are the orange. So you can see it's pretty geographically concentrated and is going to be a really good predictor of where palm oil is produced today. So this is my IV estimation strategy. So because I want to look at the boom and bust period, and I have the producer indicator interacted with the period dummies, I'm going to interact my instrument with the period dummy twice, so the boom and the bust, to correct for the endogeneity in that producer indicator. So, but in the second stage, it's a identical estimation to the ones that I've shown you before. Okay, so we can see that once we correct for some of this endogeneity, my estimates increase. They increase actually by about 5 times. So for producers in that boom period, they're actually going to see an increase in household expenditure of about 34%. And for producers in the bust, it's going to decline by about 25%. So again, I control for baseline characteristics and estimate again on the reduced sample size. Here is a coefficient plot so that you can see it more clearly. we have my main estimation, the baseline controls, and the reduced sample size. So we're seeing this familiar pattern of an increase during the boom and a fall during the bust. So this coefficient plot compares the IV estimates to the regular panel OLS estimates I showed you first. So first we have, so this just shows like really how different they are. And it suggests that the panel OLS estimates are downward biased. So the reason I think the IV corrects for some of this downward bias is that, you know, the instrument is the percent of land that's suitable for oil palm. And so it's going to put more weight on those districts that produce oil palm more intensively. Okay, so just as a summary, during the boom, household expenditure increases by about 34%. And this actually translates into an elasticity of about 0.1. So if the palm oil price triples during the boom, but household expenditure only increases by about 34%. But during the bust, household expenditure falls by 25%. And this translates into an elasticity of 0.5 because from 2008 to 2015, the price of palm oil halves and decreases by 50%. So it appears that household expenditure is much more responsive to this negative shock. So next I look at health and education spending specifically. There's a lot of reasons we're interested in these indicators, mostly because we're interested in investments in human capital and really increasing people's welfare. So these two categories, for these two categories, I follow the same IV strategy as with total expenditure because we know the regular panel OLS estimates will be downward biased. So for education spending, during the boom so this is from 2000 to 2008, for producers, there's really no significant change in spending on education. But during the bust, there is a significant decline in spending on education, specifically in producer districts. And this estimate is very consistent across specifications. And so this is a coefficient plot. And so we see actually a very different pattern from the pattern seen before. So really no change during the boom, but this very large decrease during the bust. And I also look at spending on health. So during the boom in producer districts, we see a very large increase in spending on health. But during the bust, we see a subsequent decline of nearly the same magnitude. And these estimates are consistent across specifications. So here, the pattern is much more familiar to the previous estimates. So we see that during the boom, health expenditure rises, and during the bust, it falls. So just as a recap, for education spending, during the boom, there's no change, but during the bust, that coefficient translates into about a decline in 65%. And this translates into an elasticity of 1.3. So health spending is much more sensitive to changes in income, or education is. And health, during the boom, it increases by about 200%. For an elasticity of about 0.7. During the bust, it falls by about 67%. for a similar elasticity to education of 1.3. So there are some limitations to my study. First, I don't account for the intensity of production. The instrument somewhat accounts for that, but it would be interesting maybe later on to look at districts that are really intensively producing palm oil compared to those that only have moderate production. And I only look at aggregate changes in a district because I aggregate up to the district level to use panel techniques. But I don't really can't say anything about the response of specific households. So looking at household characteristics. Also, I don't take into account local CPI changes because we would expect during a boom that local prices should increase. So actually, I think if I took that into account, real consumption, the effects on real consumption could be negative. So also, just because of the time period and when the palm oil boom happened, these are really only short run estimates, and it's going to take, well, just waiting for more data to look at the long run effects. So in conclusion, I show that household spending is more sensitive to the bust than the boom. I wrote that incorrectly. Yeah. So smallholders are more exposed to these price changes, while corporate districts appear more insulated. And spending on education and health exhibit drastically different behavior. So in this paper, I think I offer a richer theory for the impact of commodity price shocks on household consumption. I'm trying to emphasize that structural properties of production for commodities, not just palm oil, but other agricultural commodities, are really important for determining what the impact of a boom and bust would be on households. And I think these results suggest that palm oil production might not be a sustainable poverty reduction strategy because really the effects on household expenditure depend on what the global price of palm oil is. And so producing palm oil is exposing households to the volatility of the global price. So in some future work, I want to look at changes in employment in these districts. So seeing if there's sectoral change in employment by sector, and try and dig into more of the general equilibrium effects of the boom and bust. And so I just look at average household expenditure. I don't actually estimate the effect on poverty. So it would be interesting to see what the effect on poverty was during the bust. Could look at spillover effects into adjacent but non-producing districts. And I would like to dig more into the household level explanation. So seeing whether households are vulnerable to these negative shocks because they don't have access to savings and credit. All right. Yeah. Thank you.
Three questions. Please mention your name and institutions to be on. Thank you. Okay, one and another two. Yeah. Okay. Do you want to answer questions first?
My question actually related with your conclusions. May you return on your conclusion? Why you end up with the last conclusion that palm oil production may not sustainable poverty reduction because benefit to household rely on high global price. I mean, all of the export commodities will have the same conclusion with that. If you rely on oil or like metal or something like that, it can be have some it can draw some conclusion on that. Uh, and then my second question is related with the why you don't take into account the intensity of productions, the district with the intensive production of palm oil, because Indonesia actually only like 10 district that have palm oil intensive, uh, but you take into account all of the province, right? Yeah. I think it's quite easy to just draw 10 province that have a palm oil intensive. Thank you.
Okay, so for the first question, yeah, definitely that's true. It applies to really any commodity that is traded globally because the price is going to be really volatile. But I think it's an important conclusion really because it's been previously asserted that it does help reduce poverty. But it's just I think the key part of that conclusion is that it's not sustainable, right? So maybe when the price is high, households are going to leave poverty, but when the price is low, they're going to fall back into poverty. And yeah, so I mean, I could look more specifically at household like districts that are intensively in production, but I mean, there's still like that endogeneity problem of these households are these places are selecting into palm oil production, and I think that if you just looked at the household or the districts that are more intensively producing palm oil, you're going to see that just the impact is much higher. So there's going to be maybe more translation of the price into household consumption.
Sorry. Hi, thanks for the presentation. Just two quick questions to make sure I sort of understand the results. So your comparison group is non-producer districts in period one, is it? So that's one question you can answer later, I think. The second one is what does productivity look like over the years? Because you showed the amount of land used in Indonesia for oil palm production and then the amount of production, but then what about productivity itself? So tons per hectare, over time. Thanks.
Uh, yeah. The comparison group is going to be non-producers. So they're not necessarily like a perfect comparison group. You might be thinking like, oh, they're really different from producing districts, but really, it's okay because they follow a parallel trend prior to the boom. So with the fixed effects, it's going to take care of any of those differences. So yes, the estimates are compared to non-producer districts. And the second question, I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I imagine productivity is increasing over this time period. But I don't think that it really challenges these results. Actually, it would probably help. Um, so if households are becoming more productive over time, so they're more productive during the bust, they're producing more palm oil. Um, the it's actually going to downward bias the effect of the bust, right? Because if you're producing more palm oil during these later periods and the price of palm oil falls, your income isn't going to be falling as much as it would if you weren't as productive. Does that answer your question?
Uh, the productivity of palm oils have like a trend when it's I believe you already know that in the third year they we cannot harvest, but after like 3 and 12 or 50 the yield will increase drastically, but after that will decrease. So I think it's really significant to your uh, prediction as well, because the trend is quite predictable actually, the productivity, and if you're taking into account in your analysis, it will be um, quite have a different, maybe we'll draw different conclusion or the result.
Yeah, I think it would only be a problem if it's happening across the entire district. So it really only matters if average productivity in the district is declining. Um, so if that's true for an entire district, like all of the palm oil trees in a plantation are the same in a district are the same age, and they're declining just as the bust hits, then that would be a problem. But yeah, I could look into it. I find it kind of unlikely though, if as long as like all the age of the trees has some diversity across the district. Yeah.
Two.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Derrick. My name is Jasmine. I'm from Directorate of Population Planning and Social Protection in Partners. I want you to more elaborate about the why the increase during the boom boost in household health expenditure is higher, is 200%. And then if we taking into account that first you take into account that the income is from the household, or this expenditure is from the household, but the production is more like in the district level. So it can be very biased in in for looking into indicator like school attainment or utilization of health service in the district, uh, because the facility can be financed through the tax, or for here for Indonesia from uh, dana dana sumber daya alam, or the tax from the natural resource, and the another one is from the household expenditure, which it can be very biased result for that one. Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Debbie. Is I'm interested with the your presentation about palm plantation, but I have a question about the environmental issue, because I saw it's some literature about palm plantation is such as a coal exploration affecting to the global warming. So, do you have an idea how to anticipate the situation? Thank you.
So for the first question, I definitely agree with you that if you want to actually look at education and health outcomes, so like educational attainment, immunizations in these areas, that's going to tell you more about like changes in actually human capital. And so I wish I had access to that kind of data to make that estimation, but I don't. So that's why I just look at health and education spending. Yeah. So, but I'm happy to talk about that later with you. And so, to answer your question about environmental costs, so I don't really perform any estimations about like environmental impact. I just kind of I think it's important to motivate the study because it's really relevant to um, people in Indonesia and also for like deciding what to do in terms of policy. So I think it just contributes to that debate, but really my research doesn't directly talk about the environmental impact.
Yeah.
I'm Nirwan from the ILO Jakarta. The first question related with uh, did you also look at the macro level of the impact of price, which, for example, this conclusion relate with the very micro at the household level, but also do you look at the macro level how the price impact is really improving Indonesian income, for example, and then in average it is mentioned as a economic value for Indonesia. And then the second one is also related with you also analyze the impact throughout the value chain. For example, if your conclusion is that there is a effect of boom and bust with the household expenditure, and how about with the entire sectors? For example, just an assumption whether or not, because if there is a problem, then we could next analyze all the effect throughout the sectors. For example, if there is a bottleneck that of influencing the household in getting more benefit from the house from the price boom, for example, like that. Thank you.
So for the first question, definitely, I mean, at the aggregate level, a price boom is going to bring in a lot of export revenue. So I know like palm oil itself is about like 10% of Indonesian exports in terms of value. But I mean, that's something that's easy to observe and easy to like measure. You just look at how much you export relative to the price. But I think what I'm doing here is looking at how much of that aggregate revenue at the macro level actually reaches the micro level. And so, I mean, like a macroeconomic study would be something like quite different. And no, I don't look at the value chain. But definitely that's another interesting research topic. So,
Thank you. If there's any questions?
Hi, Peter Riddlecar from Reality Check Approach, Palladium. Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. Is it? I know you said it was aggregated at district level, and you can't look too much deeper within that. But would it be possible to try and dig a little bit at variations between households? And in particular, if there's variations between, say, the middlemen and families, who may be more or less connected to the actual market prices. But some of the studies that we've found was that the poorer families are less connected to market fluctuations, and so you could hypothesize that the middlemen are actually taking more of the income when the market goes up, and then if the price comes down, then they're pushing that back down onto poorer families.
yeah, so the reason I look at the average in a district is that in Susanas you can't identify which households produce palm oil. You just know their sector of employment, like if they're in agriculture. So no, I wouldn't be able to look at like middlemen versus palm oil producers. That would require like a different data set. But it's definitely something to take into account.
as your topic for this?
So, my advisor works pretty intensively in Southeast Asia. So, when I was choosing a topic, I knew that I wanted to work in Southeast Asia. And I initially kind of landed on Indonesia from actually looking at deindustrialization, so kind of the stagnant or decline in manufacturing in Indonesia, and also the stagnation in the real wage. And so I was going to look at that through the framework of like a resource curse, but not just palm oil, looking at like agricultural and other commodities. So a previous version of this paper had been looking at like the fossil fuel production as well across Indonesia and trying to look at the differences between those two types of commodities. But the reason I landed on palm oil is one, I thought it was um, a much more unique topic. It's something that hadn't been studied before, and I thought that it would really like fit well in the literature. Um, and I mean, palm oil is just so unique in Indonesia because it expanded so rapidly. It's such an important part of the economy. And I think it's a really important topic to study. It impacts the livelihoods of a lot of people.
Related to, is there any changes between districts when the first is the producers, like the category is changes between years, in years, like from the producer, then they become the non-producer? Is there any threshold for the producers?
Yeah, so the producer variable is you are classified as a producer if you ever produce palm oil. And so I realized like in this category, it's I'm going to be including like really small producers, but it really that would just downward bias the results. So you're going to be including like districts in there that uh, really aren't going to respond to the palm oil price change in terms of household expenditure. So I don't know if that answers your question. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Allison, for a very interesting presentation. I have two questions or comments. The first one, I'm a bit puzzled by your third limitations that you didn't take into account CPI. Do you really only use nominal household expenditure data from Susunas?
Yes.
So what does it mean? I mean, because with nominal expenditure, we cannot really say anything about welfare effect, for example, from the boom and bust on household welfare. Secondly, I also did not really agree with your conclusions on poverty, because you only take into account the average income, average expenditure, and hence we don't really know whether what happened to the poor, yeah, or to the people at the lower distribution, because it may be that all that happens, the increase and the decrease in expenditure, only happens at the middle class and upper level segment of population, and nothing happened to the poor, for example.
So I think it's okay that I don't take into account CPI changes. So, well, first it's going to control for with the district with the year fixed effects. it controls for changes in CPI at the national level. So definitely if it's something that's happening like regionally over time, it's not something I'm taking into account.
So you use
Yeah,
CPI, but only the national
no,
CPI.
I don't use CPI, but because I use time trends, I control for any time trend. So if like the CPI is rising over time, it's going to be absorbed by that year fixed effect. So it should take that into account. But if a region is their CPI is changing over time at a rate that's like different than all of the districts, than the national level, then that could be a problem. But I don't imagine that the CPI is going to fall that much. I mean, if anything, it's going to be increasing over time. So since I am looking at nominal expenditures, so an increase maybe like, I mean, it might bias like the boom estimates, but in terms of the bust estimates, it might bias those upwards. But the bust estimates, it would bias them upwards, which would help, because if if your CPI is increasing, but we still see that your expenditure is falling, that means like your real consumption, your real expenditure is falling by more. So, sorry, what was your other question? Oh, about poverty. Oh, yes. Yeah. So, I mean, the thing with looking at the distribution within a district is that I think that's like a little bit more troublesome, because you might have the poor like moving between districts. There might be like changes in terms of like the distribution of the population, but I think if you look at the average expenditure, it indicates better what's happening for the whole district. So I mean, an extension of this work could look at like inequality, or like just look at expenditure for the top 20% or the bottom 10%. But I think that does have like a little bit. I would be a little bit more worried about bias due to like migration between districts, or maybe like people falling in and out of the same, like, yeah. But I mean, it's definitely an extension of the work that you could do. But I mean, what I'm showing is that on average, this is what is happening in these districts.
Uh, we have a last questions from those who's watching online. The question is from Radi. What is your policy recommendations on sustainability in palm oil sector, especially for the smallholder?
So, by sustainability, do you mean environmental sustainability? Do you think?
Yeah, good.
Okay. So, that's not really my area of research. Let's see. I think that's something I'd have to think about more. In terms of my results, if you wanted to protect smallholders more in terms of seeing what happens to household consumption, then you'd have to do something to insulate them more from price shocks. So maybe like more access to savings, access to credit to smooth consumption over time could be something that would help.
I think we come to the end of today's sessions. Is there any that you would like to share with us?
Well, I just want to thank everyone for coming. I'm happy to talk with everyone afterwards. This is going to be my job market paper. It's still a work in progress, so any suggestions and advice that you have, I'm happy to talk about it, and I'd be very grateful. So thank you for coming.
Okay. Thank you, Allison. Today's presentations will be sent through individual email, so please make sure that you write your email address correctly and clearly. And we are pleased to have Allison here today, and for that, SMERU has a thankful gift for Allison that will be presented by Pa Asep as the director of SMERU Research Institute.
Thank you.
SMERU still hosts one last FKP sessions on Tuesday, 31st October of 2017. The presenter is Mayang Rizky, who will present her latest study on corruptions, governance, and inequality. So if you are interested on corruptions and inequality, then we are welcome you to Tuesday FKP sessions. On behalf of SMERU, thank you for being here and participating in today's FKP. Thank you.